Hi, I'm Michael Frye, and this is the second part of my photo critique of David Eaton's image called Mist. And here I'm going to talk about how I reprocessed the photograph. Now, this isn't the appropriate time and place to go into a detailed explanation of my Lightroom workflow. The best way to do that is to read my ebook, Light and Land, Landscapes in the Digital Darkroom. And of course you can find prominent links to that on my website and blog. But I do want to show you what I did to this particular image, and we'll start by going back to Lightroom's default settings. Now, if you've read Light and Land, you know that I like to start with this stuff over here zeroed out. So I'm going to set the blacks, brightness, and contrast to 0, and I'm going to change this default medium contrast point curve to linear. Now, I'd rather start with all of these things zeroed out, straight as it were, because I'm going to do everything with the point curve, rather than moving these sliders, which essentially manipulate the tone curve in the image, although it doesn't show up down here. I'm going to go kind of straight to the source and do it all here. Again, I have some video tutorials that talk about curves and talk about why I change those default settings and zero them out, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that here. You'll notice, of course, that since I did zero those things out and make this curve straight, that the image has become even darker and flatter. Look at this histogram here, it's very narrow. But all that is easily fixed. When I see an underexposed photograph like this, with lots of room between the brightest pixels and the right edge of the histogram, the first thing that I do is move the white point. That's the upper end of this point curve. And by the way, in Lightroom there are two types of curves. There's the parametric curve, and then if you click this little box down here in the lower right, that takes you to the point curve, where you can actually move the ends of the curve, which you can't do in the parametric curve. So I'm going to move this end, the upper end, which is the white point, and you can see that that brightens the image. It's also kind of stretching out the histogram, right? So that already looks better. This already looks better over here. I don't want to go too far here. I could certainly go further, maybe about that far before I start to get washed out highlights in the photograph. But when we're talking about colorful highlights, I don't usually want them butting up against that right edge of the histogram. Colors should be not quite that bright, or they'll start to look a little too hot or washed out. So I'll back off here, maybe around there, where the brightest colors like this leaf here don't look too hot. Now, people sometimes ask me, when I'm dealing with an underexposed image like this, why would I move the white point here rather than pushing the exposure slider to the right? And the reason is because the two tools don't behave in the same way. And I'll show you a little comparison here. So here's a little snapshot that I made where I moved the white point over a little bit further with the point curve. The exposure slider is at 0. And you can see that I brought the brightest pixels near but not touching the right edge of the histogram. And here's another little snapshot that I made where I pushed the exposure slider to the right so that those brightest pixels are near but not touching the right edge of the histogram. That was an increase of plus 2.2, and I left the point curve alone. And let's look at the difference here. Here's doing it with the point curve. Sorry, be easier to see there. Here's doing it with the point curve, and here's doing it with the exposure slider. So the brightest pixels in the image are at the same place, but the exposure slider has lightened the image overall more. It's boosted the midtones, actually. And that tends to make the highlights and lighter colors in an image look kind of flat and washed out. And the reason for that is when you actually move that exposure slider, it does two things. It's kind of like moving the white point here with the curve, something like that, but you're also boosting the midtones somewhat, like that. When you're looking at a curve, the steeper the line of the curve, the more contrast there is. So by boosting those midtones, you're increasing contrast in the shadows, but flattening it a little bit in the highlights. And that's why you can get kind of flat, washed out looking highlights in images by pushing that exposure slider. So I would prefer to not do that, to not boost those midtones, and just have a nice straight line here, which is what you get by moving the white point in the point curve. Okay, I'm going to move that white point back to where I had it before, where the lightest pixels aren't quite so close to the right edge. And I'm also going to move the black point. You know, the image still looks a little bit faded and kind of flat. So I'm going to deepen the blacks by moving the black point over to the right. I always want to keep that along the bottom edge, just as I want to keep the white point along the top edge here. And just those two moves have made a nice steep line in the curve, have increased the overall contrast, and I think made it look a lot better. Now I think the image could still be a bit lighter, so I'm going to make what I call a lightening S-curve. Something like maybe that. So an S-curve brings out mid-tone contrast. And that looks about right to me. That seems like the appropriate overall brightness and contrast. If we look at the histogram, it fills up most of the available space, but there's nothing butting up against either edge. More importantly, the highlights look bright but not too hot, you know, not washed out or close to being washed out. There's some weight or depth in the darkest shadows, like over here. Now I really only did two other things to this image. I adjusted the white balance. As shot, it was about 5500K, which is close, but it seems maybe just a little bit too warm. I can play around with this. You know, if I go warmer, push this to the right, it makes it yellow. Again, as I pointed out earlier, the fog becomes yellow. We lose kind of the color contrast between green and yellow in here. If we go to the left, we can make that fog kind of blue, which sets up a color contrast, but I think that's kind of too much. So somewhere, I think around 5000K seems to be the sweet spot for this. I ended up about 5100 or so, which leaves the fog just ever so slightly on the blue side, not quite neutral. And that gives it just a little bit of a color contrast between that slightly cool fog and the warm yellow leaves over here. You could go, you know, a little bit cooler than that and set up even more of a color contrast depending on taste, but I kind of liked it about there or so. Now I also increased the clarity just a bit, and I didn't touch the vibrance or saturation because the increased contrast that I made with the curve also boosted the saturation. Anytime you increase an image's contrast, you're going to add saturation as well, and so it seems plenty saturated to me at this point. Now there are probably a few other refinements that I would make to this, but really that's most of it. The point curve did most of the heavy lifting as usual. You know, this is a very powerful tool, and with these 4 points, a black point, white point, 1/4 point, and 3/4 point. You can control how much of an image is pure black, or how close do things get to pure black, how much of an image is pure white, or how close do things get to pure white, and the overall brightness and contrast of the photograph. So I hope you found that helpful, and thanks for watching.